So welcome everyone to today's CSE webinar as part of the Development in Action webinar series. Today's webinar is on gender and development in Fiji and the Pacific, a practitioner's perspective, a very interesting topic delivered by a Commonwealth alumnus, Kaushal Sharma, who is a 2016 Commonwealth scholar from Fiji. Kaushal completed her MSc in Gender Development and Globalization from the London School of Economics and Political Science. A brief introduction about Kaushal. Kaushal is the founder of the Gender Agenda. It's a consultancy business focused on providing technical support on gender and development in Fiji and the Pacific. So if you are from the region, from the Pacific region, if you want to continue conversations, please do get in touch with Kaushal, or if you are working within the gender and development space in general, and if you'd like to learn more about gender equality, gender rights in Fiji and the Pacific, please also do get in touch with Kaushal. Kaushal has vast experience of working across a spectrum of projects on gender, women's rights, feminist movement building, capacity building, policy influencing, and also access to justice and women's economic empowerment. And today in this webinar, she will briefly speak about her work in Fiji and the Pacific, focusing on gender equality and also the national plan that she is working on. So over to you, Kaushal.
Thank you so much, Evangeline, and thank you for the warm introduction. Hello, everyone. As Evangeline mentioned, my name is Kaushal Sharma, and I'm very much honored and excited to have this opportunity to be able to connect and engage with you and share about the work I do, but also get this opportunity to talk about the Pacific region, which often sometimes gets missed out from the overall discourses around gender or development and other spaces. So grateful to be here. I shall move on to showing you a bit of the outline of what we'll be discussing today that I'll be sharing with you. I wanted to start off by sharing about the gender and development context and share a bit more about the Pacific region. It's unique and it's different. It has its own set of challenges, which might be similar and different in various fronts. I also wanted to share my experience of working as a practitioner within this space. So moving from a Commonwealth scholar, studying about gender, to practicing about gender and working within this space. And I also would like to share a bit around the work that I do. And I'll be more specifically sharing the work that I'm doing, the lessons I'm learning as we are developing Women's Economic Empowerment National Action Plan for the first time in Fiji and even for the Pacific region. So that's an exciting piece of work that I'm really, really grateful to be part of. And I wanted to also end the conversation on the lessons that I've learned along the way, both personal and professional experiences, which might resonate with all of you that are working within your various spaces. So that's basically the outline that I have for the webinar today. Once again, I'd like to thank Evangeline for all the help and the support she has provided me to be able to present and be prepared for this. So let me begin by sharing with you the context of the South Pacific region. Now, as you can see from the map, the South Pacific region is vast. It's a lot of oceans and a lot of islands. So in fact, when I started my Commonwealth scholar journey, a lot of people would ask me, where are you from? And I'd say I'm from Fiji. And it's often difficult to situate Fiji. Where is Fiji? So we'd always say it's near Australia, near New Zealand, in terms of situating ourselves within the broader geography of the world. So if you look at that image, you'd see that there are around 22 Pacific islands and territories. And these are located between 161.76 million kilometers of ocean space. Each island is unique. It has its own geographical compositions. Some are atolls, some are volcanic islands, some are flat islands. So it presents its own specific challenges as well. There are different cultural practices, different cultures, different languages. Each island differs in the scale in terms of human development, infrastructure, connectivity. So it presents a unique set of challenges. And most often than not, there's this perception of Pacific Island that its islands are isolated in the sea. But one of the things that I really admire is one of the scholars, Ipeli Haufa, he says, let's not see Pacific Islands in that way. We have to see the sea is very much part of our cultural identity. So we are a sea of islands rather than islands in the sea, because the sea connects, it provides resources, it acts as a connection point rather than a barrier for us within the region. And that's how we should start envisioning it. I haven't walked in all of these island spaces. I've walked in Fiji, in Samoa, in Solomon Islands, Tonga, and a bit of experience walking in Kiribati and PNG. So that's just a brief overview of the Pacific region and what it looks like geographically. But I would definitely love to share more in terms of gender and what does the gender context within the Pacific region looks like. So happy to move on to the next slide for that particular piece of information. So within the Pacific Island, if I had to look at the gender context, I just wanted to share a brief overview of few of the dimensions that we look at. One of the things that is very, very strong is that the Pacific Island has the highest rates of violence against women. So 2 in every 3 Pacific Island women are impacted by gender-based violence. Most of this is in terms of intimate partner violence. And that's probably because of the range of factors. It's because of the culture, the influence of religion, the stigma around women accessing justice, the different levels of awareness and access to support mechanisms, and that makes it complicated. For example, if I have to give you an example, let's say, imagine someone living in an atoll which has a population of, let's say, 50 people in one community, and the nearest police station or nearest support center is in another island that is 2 hours away from both, right? Imagine how much difficulty a person would have in terms of trying to access support services if you're currently experiencing violence. So those are some of the complexities in relation to that. We also have some of the lowest levels of participation in women, around 8.6. The global average is 26.9. So roughly around 54 out of 614 plus MPs within 14 island countries are women, and that excludes Australia and New Zealand. So we still have a lot more work to do when it comes to women's political participation within parliaments, but also a lot more work to do when it comes to women's participation in decision-making levels within private and public sector as well. For the Pacific region, women's labor force participation varies, but what is very, very common is that women are often heavily found within the informal sector, within low-paying jobs, within what we call feminized sectors, whether it be service sector, education, health, social work, tourism, garment industry, food processing. So you see a lot more women's participation in these sectors. And there is, like I said, significant vertical occupational segregation. That means we have a lot of women in low-paying jobs or lower tier jobs, but they are not able to escalate up the ladder within their careers. So moving on to the next slide, a bit more to unpack in terms of gender. The remoteness and the level of access to digital technology is also a major barrier for women to be able to access information. A lot of government systems and platforms are now moving towards digitalization. And people that do not have access to phones, technologies, or even know how to use digital platforms and spaces, such as for registering their businesses or accessing loans, applying for grants, face significant more challenges. So that needs to be looked at in terms of access. Climate change is a major issue within the Pacific region. All Pacific Island countries face the impact of climate change, and a lot of this is impacting women because women are majority using they invest or they're earning income from agricultural economy and forestry and fisheries. And because climate change impacts this, it creates a lot of, I guess, difficulty for women to be able to have a continued sustained income. And every year there's a cycle of disasters and natural disasters that come in and out. So you basically in a cycle trying to survive, adapt, rebuild, survive, adapt, and rebuild. So that is the lived reality right now. There are countries that have they protect women's rights, but in terms of legal rights for women, there's still a lot of work to be done because there's lots of discriminatory legislation around citizenship, for instance, legislation around age of consent, legislation around property and land rights, especially in countries that have customary regulations. That severely impacts women's access and opportunity. Um, as you can see, laws maintaining equal pay and sexual harassment are the least enacted laws. So that is something that needs to be enforced as well. Moving on to the next slide. So as I mentioned, a lot of women within the Pacific region and within Fiji in particular, they fall into informal economy. They have low productivity jobs, and within the lower hierarchy. And the majority of the women spend a lot more time than men. And I know that might be the case in other countries as well on care. For instance, in Fiji, I guess women spend significantly way much time, double the time than males when it comes to domestic and care responsibilities. Apart from that, many of the traditional community structures are communally lived. So there are increased burdens for women when it comes to because they have community roles to serve apart from their own family roles and functions within their households. So there's significant burden of unpaid care work on women. And majority of the women are in the MSME sector. Almost 90.2% of Pacific women owned MSMEs are in the informal sector. So there's a significant challenge for women to grow and transition within their businesses or employment from the informal economy to the formal economy. And there are a lot of challenges that women face when it comes to accessing finance, accessing business information and advice, having access to the right kind of skill sets and opportunities, access to resources because it's tied to the idea of who owns the land, who owns the assets, whether you have collateral to get a loan that you want to set up or start or further advance your businesses. So all of those things are very interconnected. But it's important to note that no one woman's experience is same. So there are unique experiences that different women face. So within the same country and same community, even the experiences of older women will be significantly different from the experiences and lived realities of younger women. Women with disabilities in particular are very, very marginalized, invisible within structures, and there needs to be a lot more work done to address the specific vulnerabilities of different groups of women. So that's just basically the South Pacific gender context. I focus more on the barriers and the challenges to just to give you a description of what development work would look like and target within these particular areas. So the other thing I wanted to talk about was taking a step back. So that is the Pacific context in which we operate in. And then you're doing gender work within this specific context, trying to address the critical issues that I've just pointed out in various ways through programmatic work, through government policy reform, through institutional reforms, and so many other ways in which interventions are made. And these interventions are made by various stakeholders, development agencies are involved, women's groups are involved, ministries of women are involved, other government agencies, faith-based organizations, civil society. So there are a lot of actors that are working or trying to work within this space. And when you look at development and how development operates, and look at gender and women's groups and feminism ideologies, I do feel like there is a bit of disconnect between the two. And sometimes what I've noticed is that sometimes it's very hard to try and connect these two pieces together fundamentally. For example, I'll give you some examples. Um, Donor-driven priorities, the idea of value for money, the idea for result-based approach. It's something that is, like, I guess it is a donor-driven language and development-driven language, and it can mean very different things for different groups. If you look at the gender and the amount of investment that goes to gender work, it's often saturated. So you'll see a lot more money or funding that is flowing into gender-based violence work because the narrative around the Pacific having the worst rate of gender-based violence in the world is very strong. So a lot of attention and effort and priority goes to GBV. Then you have priority that goes to women's economic empowerment through very visible projects like markets, accessing infrastructure, and providing opportunities for women to be able to sell their produce. Very few of the funding goes to fund work around women's in leadership. There's always a struggle to find donors and agencies that want to fund this work on women's to leadership, because it's the work around leadership may not be as overt, as visible, as result oriented, uh, um, uh, as the other work, because it takes a lot of effort. Let's say if your SDG indicator is X amount of women in parliament, it will take a lot more years and a lot more of norms change and other kinds of work to be able to advance that progress compared to putting in services for GBV. So the priorities are often donor driven. So not all agendas within the gender space receive the same amount of attention. And most often than not, the programs are often designed by foreign experts in a very top-to-down model. So in most cases, partners are an afterthought rather than being forefront, and sometimes rather being active part of conceptualization of projects. So often you'd have consultation, someone comes and develops a concept note, develops a proposal. Once the proposal is accepted and approved, and then they reach out and say to the local partner, now you can be part of this. Rather than engaging local groups, communities, feminist organizations, women's groups, to be co-creating and be actively involved in developing the program. And I think that's why we need to decolonize how development operates, so that you are rooted and connected to the context and responding to the context in the way that um, the the country or the stakeholders, the beneficiaries, consider it to be important and relevant to them and to their needs. And I think that's very, very important. And the idea of what transformative is, what is a good result, can be very, very different for different stakeholders. Development agencies would think, for example, X amount of women have accessed courts for their issues. That is a result for them. For CSOs, it would mean X amount of women that they have been part of their advocacy and awareness program. For women themselves, it would simply, majority of them, they just want the violence to stop. They want, they don't want to be, they don't want their husbands to do that to them. So it differs from different perspectives. And how do you feed that into a program, into when you have different ideas of what results look like? The other challenge that we usually have is when you look at the Asia and the Pacific region, and majority of the projects, especially by large development agencies, they say this is a project that's happening in Asia and the Pacific region. And what happens is that often the Pacific becomes a small p in the bigger Asia Pacific context. So you often have situations and examples of one random Pacific island country thrown into a particular project, just so that it looks like a project that covers Asia and the Pacific region. Of course, there's issues and challenges around rigid financial systems. So donors have certain kind of compliances to meet and standards, which many of the women's organizations that are starting out, that are trying to work, groups that do really good work, but they don't have the capacity to absorb such large amount of funding. Two, the financial, they're not able to comply with the financial standards when reporting. So how do you support women-led groups and organizations that are starting out, but they're doing good work within the communities? And there's also often the danger of NGOization. So once women's groups and institutions start, and in order to get money to sustain to do the work that they want to do, they have to shift their priorities and start speaking in donor or development kind of language, looking at values for money, looking at top-down approach, looking at theory of change and program logic models, uh, uh, that can be very contradictory to even talk about feminism. Feminism is all about dismantling power, patriarchy. It's about decolonization and seizing the power back. It's about context. It's about representation. So there's often an ideological, operational, and programmatic contradictions between the two spaces, but there are ways to work around it, and I think many feminist organizations have tried to be true to their values and missions, and have said that these are the things we want to work in. This is how we want to work in. If you're interested, you can come and find us. So there are ways in which organizations have negotiated and being able to move around and get support for the work they do. But most often it is all about power negotiation. So that's, I guess, the complexity of working in gender and development space. And I'm sure it's very, very familiar to you as you are listening to me. And it's something that's common across the region in other countries as well. Now, I wanted to share in the next slide, I wanted to share some examples of the current work I'm doing. So there are many areas I've worked in. I've worked with the CSO, feminist movements. I've worked with educational institutions and also development agencies. The core areas that I've worked in is women's leadership, feminist movement, policy reform, work around gender data, gender energy, trafficking in persons, responsive budgeting, and currently around women's economic empowerment. So thinking it from an SDG lens, I guess the work I do and the organizations I work with contribute to SDG goals 5, 8, 7, 16, and 10 as core direct interventions that relate to these particular SDG goals and frameworks. But I really wanted to share the work around Women's Economic Empowerment National Action Plan with you, perhaps in the policy development space. There are a lot of interesting learnings that I've learned through the way with that particular piece of work. So in the next slide, I'm sharing a bit more on the Fiji Women's National Action Plan for Economic Empowerment. If you can move to the next slide. Yes. So this particular work I'm doing in my capacity as a consultant, as a WENAP coordinator. And the WENAP stands for Women's Economic Empowerment National Action Plan. This is a 5-year action plan that the Ministry of Women is trying to develop because there wasn't any cohesive approach to women's economic empowerment, and there was notably a lot of issues in the we space that were coming up and emerging, like for example, disparity in labor force participation, wage gap, and the cases of sexual harassment in certain sectors, gender-based discrimination in certain industry sectors, and a lot of women being tied to informal, underpaid, under-acknowledged work. So the idea of having a national action plan, I guess, is to start a whole of government transformative evidence-based positive approach. So what the Ministry of Women is trying to do in this space is try to to engage with different stakeholders and say work together and come up with concrete actions that they could take to advance progress on women's economic empowerment. And it's based on existing review that has been done by the government of Fiji. So the last year, the government of Fiji launched its very comprehensive Fiji country gender assessment. It was a government-led process, and that has data from all the government agencies and any existing data that was available. So based on those evidences, uh, um, uh, there would be interventions designed, and these interventions will be costed, and it is going to be multi-stakeholder. So not just government, but also engage with development partners, donor agencies, civil society in particular area of work. The whole goal of the National Action Plan is to advance progress on women's economic empowerment. And it is something that I guess is also a good space as a lesson learned for other Pacific Island countries as well in terms of developing their own national action plan. So moving on to the next slide. So I just wanted to share a bit around the process that we took. And this is the process that is based on the learning that came out of developing a national action plan for gender-based violence. A typical policy development approach that is usually taken, but it does have significant challenges along the way. So the first thing, it's a 1 year process. So we started in March with a concept around our consultation, our methodology, our desk review and literature review to see what is happening where within the we space, and who should we be consulting. So significant work went around stakeholder mapping, around trying to identify if there are any other existing policy recommendations that should be captured, a lot of mapping around what are the major issues that are coming up based on the existing evidence and assessments. So that was done in March. Um, we were supposed to finish our consultations by July, but in, in the breadth and the depth of the coverage, we're still ongoing with the consultation. So the consultations has two approach. One is to create awareness on women's economic empowerment, and two, to get stakeholder opinions and buy-ins. And what we tried to do here was we tried to use a two-tier approach. First, we went to the women to ask about issues, challenges, and what their recommendations were. And once we got these recommendations from our divisional level consultation, we went to the north, we went to the central, eastern divisions to get women's insights from the different regions of the country. And then based on the recommendations, we analyzed the recommendations, and then we had directed specific questions for stakeholders. So for instance, a lot of women talk to us about issues and challenges with registering their business because the platforms are online and they have issues with digital connectivity and the forms are very hard to access. So that was our point of conversation with the registrar company to say, look, this is the issues and challenges women are facing. And we have a lot of women that want to be registered because if they're not registered, then they can't access grants, they can't access loans. So registration is basically a pathway to accessing more financial funding and grant opportunities. How can we work with you to try and make these platforms more accessible to women? So those are the kind of conversations we are having with various stakeholders involved, to see if we can come up with concrete actions that we can put under the National Action Plan. So once the consultations are done, we will go into review, analysis, and validation phase of it. And the significant challenge that we're currently experiencing now is that we have 300 plus recommendations. And we have so many different kind of priority issues, some at very micro level, some at macro level. Some are not still clear and concrete. There are actions that need to be done. For example, actions around gender norms. A lot of work needs to be done in terms of shifting perceptions on gender roles and expectations on who does what within the household. So the question becomes, Who takes accountability for that? Which stakeholder is going to do that work? So all of those are some of the complexities as we unpack and make the national action plan more concrete. And those are the things that's critical for the Ministry of Women and other lead stakeholders and decision makers to be involved in, to provide that level of decision making on what should we keep, what are the priorities for now, what can be reasonably achieved in 5 years with the capacity and the resources that is being promised or there is going to be available for the government to be able to do this work. So, so that's a marrying and balancing those things is one of the challenges. And love to hear your thoughts and opinions later in the Q&A session, if you have similar experiences. And then once that is done, with the finalization of it, it has to go through cabinet submission and approvals. Usually, the cabinet is very supportive of national action plan, so we keep them informed well ahead of time. So we are hoping to get this ready by December for socialization and implementation next year. So that's just a very brief overview of what the work entails in terms of what I do as a coordinator in trying to make sure I work with stakeholders, I work with our international consultants, I work with the Ministry of Women team to stick to the timelines and the processes and make sure things move along as we go along. Moving on to the next slide. So, as I said, when we did the desk review, we have 105 stakeholders. There are 95 priority areas that fall within the dimension of women's economic empowerment, reviewing around 63 plus women's economic empowerment programs from Fiji in the Pacific region. We already have around 300 plus recommendations. And the challenge that we are currently facing is how do we contain this and they without, what actions can we take out of the breadth and depth of the work that women's economic empowerment covers in a way that's concrete, transformative, and feasible and achievable. So one of the things about when we talked about the disconnect between development and women's groups and work on gender, one of the ways in which we try to bring those two elements together is ensuring that CSOs and women-led groups are well part of the process and do have a sense of ownership in this. And they are also co-developing the national action plan. It's not just the ministry or some consultant working in isolation developing this. So we have the WENAP Secretariat, and the Secretariat has 4 women-led groups that are part of the Secretariat. They are the ones that we review and endorse the WENAP, and they will play a very critical role in terms of guiding what goes into the WENAP. Then you have a whole list of stakeholders that are very interested and committed and want to be involved in this space. So we also have the task force. The task force would be more wider. It will have government agencies. It's going to have CSOs. It's going to have development partners and donors. And this task force is going to be the one that will lead the implementation of WENAP, and the Secretariat is going to guide the process. So that is how we're trying to weave in as many stakeholders and actors within the process and not losing out on the voices of women through the WENAP Secretariat. So just the brief description of what that looks like. Thank you. Moving on to the next slide. So that's the work that we do and that I do with the Women's Economic Empowerment National Action Plan. As Evangeline mentioned, I'm trying to transition into forming my own consultancy on gender and development. And I think most often when we have conversations around the work we do and the kind of change we see, one of the things that's very, very important and very, very critical is looking at intersectionality. And this is something that I've learned through my work here in the gender space, but I have also learned this from my master's in gender and development when I was studying at London School of Economics. how intersectionality can play a very, very critical role. So, how I am positioned as a female, as an Indo-Fijian, as a young woman, as someone who came from low income background, someone who is a Commonwealth scholar, someone who is able-bodied. So I have different levels of access, power, and privileges in my life. Some spaces I might feel a bit more marginalized. In some places, I do have a lot of privilege. For example, my being able to have that opportunity to study as a Commonwealth scholar has given me a lot of access and opportunities to be able to walk in the space in the way that I want to. The other factor, for example, is because I started working as a young woman below the age of 35 within this space, it is very, very difficult to make a space for yourself within a group of more older, experienced women, men working in this space. So it's about navigating the power dynamics and being very, very aware that your intersectionality shapes your professional experiences, but it also shapes your personal experiences as well. So that's one of the things that I wanted to highlight. The next thing I wanted to highlight, and I think it's very, very important to reflect on because sometimes we are too busy being action oriented and doing things that we forget to reflect on how not necessarily on the work we do, but it's important to reflect on how the work we do affects us as well. So the next slide is the idea of positionality, and it's also very, very critical to talk about positionality in terms of, for me, is trying to find a balance between what the world needs, what I love, what I'm good at, what I can be paid for. You know, and a lot of core principles that I've learned as part of my studies as a Commonwealth scholar is very, I guess it's very, very relevant to the work I do. So focusing on self-care, focusing on authenticity, and having the attitude of learning, unlearning, and relearning because the context is evolving and we constantly learning new things. But there are also sometimes we all have our inherent biases that we need to unlearn and unpack as well. Is being able to exercise your agency and work with different and difficult stakeholders and actors. Some are very willing, some are not. And, and how do you navigate through those different power dynamics and spaces? uh, when is a good moment to step up and be loud? When is a good moment to negotiate and navigate through other channels to get what needs to be done? Challenging discrimination. How do you redistribute power and resources in a way that solves the issue of inequality? And that's a very, very complex kind of question. And what can you do in your own capacity in terms of practicing everyday resistance to things that you see happening rather than staying quiet and moving along? How to occupy spaces in discussions to push for certain agendas and priorities because government has come with the priorities and how do you make gender equality or the work around women's economic empowerment a priority for them. So those are some of the critical questions that as a practitioner I'll constantly have to deal with and navigate. I don't have all the answers to that. But it's learning as you go. And I think working in with diverse range of stakeholders, it's an important skill set to have because at the end of the day, they're people and you need to learn how to connect at people level. And that helps to keep work moving along, particularly in Pacific region where relationships and people and culture is valued and prioritized. To develop the needs to operate in a different way within different cultural contexts. Um, I would like to, in the interest of time, I'd definitely like to sum up in terms of the lessons I've learned. Some of this I have already unpacked. Being willing to learn, unlearn, and relearn certain things as you go along. Being aware of your intersectionality and positionality, who you are, your age, skin color, level of education, even your ethnicity, religion, all of those things matter. in terms of the level of access and opportunity and power and privilege you have. And sometimes it's being very aware of your privilege is a good thing, so that you know that you're not using it in a way that does harm, but you're doing it in a way that does good. Knowing different actors is so critical within the space and I work in, because perceptions change. Sometimes agendas are people driven rather than institutionally driven. So it's very, very important to know who's working in this space and what their perceptions and views are. Agility in terms of navigating different kinds of power systems, knowledge, the way in which you talk to a community is very, very different from the way you'd go and present your work to a donor partner or development partner. So having the agility and knowing the different patterns of communicating, even though it may be the same messaging is critical. And knowing your boundaries is important in terms of looking at the space, assessing it, and knowing what to push for, what not to push for, and your personal boundaries in terms of how much time, energy, effort you can give. Um, and being aware of the fact that we all know that resources are limited. Uh, um, there's certain things that can be done and done well, rather than having 100 things that look beautiful on a paper or a policy document, but that are not done because there's so many things and moving parts. It's better to have few things that are clear, directional, and can be done. So, and in doing so, recognizing and being accepting of the complexity that there's always going to be trade-offs, and these trade-offs will not always be fair. And actors and development agendas shift and change within the evolving context. One week you're talking about trafficking in persons, and there's a lot of awareness around it. Next week you discover that all the attention, resources, and energy has gone into drugs. Um, or the other week it's something else, depending on who's funding, depending on the geopolitics of the region as well. And that's critical to have that lensing on the impact of political context, especially with upcoming elections that have a lot of influence in development agendas, and also change and transitions within leadership. I felt like there is something that plays a great role in terms of what gets done and what's advocated for and what becomes a priority agenda, um, especially for government. The idea around deconstructing where is power located and how is power shared. It's power to, power with, power within, rather than power over. The idea of dismantling and gender norms and stereotypes, the notion of redistributing, reallocating resources, decision-making power and capacities. All of those things are very, very critical part of advancing progress towards gender equality and women's empowerment. Um, with that note, I'll finish off my presentation. Thank you for listening to me. I'm really appreciative of your time in making time to listen to me. I open the space up for question and answers. Over to you, Evangeline, if you shall like to facilitate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kaushal, for the brilliant webinar presentation discussing your work, especially the focus on Fiji and the Pacific region within the gender development space. I would now like to open the floor for Q&A session. If you would like to raise any questions to Kaushal, please do send them via the chat box. Equally, I'm also grateful for all those who send in your questions via the registration forms. I do have the list of questions with me, so I will start with some of the questions from this list, and we will then move on to the questions in the chat box. Please feel free to send in your questions in the chat box. Thank you. So, Kaushal, if you're ready, can we start with the first question? Great.
Absolutely.
All right, so the first question is, you described your work, within the Fiji and the Pacific region. Can you specify a particular project or initiative that you have led or been a part of that focused on feminist movement building and intergenerational women's leadership, and also how this addressed gender equality issues and social inclusion, particularly for individuals with disabilities?
Thank you so much for that question. So one example that I can give you is working with the Fiji women's rights movement, and I could show the intergenerational lens. So initially, what started off as a forum to bring women together to talk about civic rights, political participation, to try and get more women into parliament and leadership positions, that conversation led to a formation of Fiji Women's Forum as a space to do a bit more on civic and political participation. And the interesting thing that we noticed was that there is an intergenerational gap. So there needed to be a special space for young women because young women felt like, oh, that's a very intimidating space for us. We don't feel comfortable because there's a power imbalance in that space. We are not able to speak in this space. So what FWRM did was they created a young women's forum to have young women within the country can have space to talk about their issues. And what happens within this space is that whatever outcomes on a regular basis that comes out of the forum discussion becomes an advocacy agenda for the organization to push for with certain stakeholders or government agencies and so forth. Within the feminist movement, I think one of the issues is the issue of sustainability because movements need to grow and develop and having a mechanism where you have girls that go through a feminist movement building program, then you have young spaces for young women, spaces for women, and now they also have space for older women. And hopefully in the future, they might have space for women with disabilities as well. And to see issues from an intersectional lens, how realities are different and agendas are different, and what we need to push for with which stakeholder. I haven't worked with women with disabilities in specifically, but as a model, for me, that is a really great model to continue building and strengthening feminist movements within space or country. Thank
That's
you.
amazing. That's amazing. And I would like to invite attendees to, if you have been working within the gender space, or if you have been working with women with disabilities, please do share your experiences in the post-webinar networking session. We would love to hear from you. All right, moving on to the next question. Women do work in different sectors, and not many times, they are the challenges are highlighted. Um, Speaking of the agriculture, gender disparity issues in agriculture, and what are some of the pathways to address these?
Thank you. I guess that's a very, very important question for me. Within Fiji in the Pacific region, a huge population of demographics of women are involved in agriculture sector in their day-to-day life, and that's their basic source of income. And so the agriculture portfolio is so important. But most often you find that it is also segregated in terms of what kind of agricultural products women choose to invest in compared to men and to what level. So you'd have the kava is very, very, very big market agricultural product in Fiji in the Pacific, and majority of the time it's men that are more involved in more prestigious kind of agricultural crops compared to women that do daily food crops, cash crops. And one of the ways that has been very, very useful for us in Fiji is the Ministry of Agriculture has been very supportive and very, very active because they recognize that women have a role to play. So what they have done is they developed their own gender strategy. Um, so any program that they have, they try and see how they can make it equitable. So if there is grants, how is it more equitable? If there's access to information, tools, equipment, how do you make it in such a way that women farmers or women in agriculture have equitable access as well as men? So they have been trying to do all of those things to make sure it's more equitable. And I think it's really, really benefiting. In fact, I think some countries, for example, Tonga has a women's division within their Ministry of Agriculture. So having a particular division that focuses on women is also, I guess, useful in terms of how government funding is used and invested in that space.
Thank you so much for highlighting that. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, there is a history of women in agriculture right from early years, in terms of the indentured laborers who were then in Fiji and other island specific countries. And I'm sure that has been documented right from the historical point of view. So thank you so much for shedding light on that. You did mention about, gender mainstreaming and how governments and agricultural sector is now gender mainstreaming within, policies. Within your work, how do you mainstream gender, in your engagements?
I think for us, it depends on what work you're doing. For example, if you're working with an institution, let's say an education institution, then you look at the the institution from all stages, whether it's their policy, whether their training and development, their curriculum, their workplace environment and practices, and see what are the levels of inclusion we then have and what are the things that needs to be changed and amended. If you're looking at policies, for example, the Women's Economic Empowerment National Action Plan, uh, there's so many recommendations that I've said that comes out. So every government we speak to, they're actually doing good work around gender, but it's not being visualized. It's not in a clear, connected, aligned, coordinated way. So everyone's out there doing their own thing. And one of the ways in which you can pull this all those different segments together is through a national action plan that's more streamlined and that exactly aligns with what each ministry or department is doing in this area. So that when you're reporting on women's economic empowerment, its whole of government approach shows exactly what the entire government is doing. And it also shifts the burden from Ministry of Women. Most cases and scenarios, when you talk about gender equality, it becomes, oh, that's Ministry of Women's job and that's their role. It's nothing to do with us. And we need to shift that kind of mindset and say, no, gender equality is a government issue. It is a wider issue and everyone is connected to it. So mainstreaming through developing an action plan is one of the useful strategies. And having a mechanism, for example, for Fiji, they have gender mainstreaming action groups. So each ministry has a focal point and there's a group, and each ministry then has a specific gender action plan and vision that they will act on. So the gender mainstreaming action group is a critical infrastructure or mechanism through which a policy like the National Action Plan can be implemented and realized. So that's an example of how mainstreaming is going to happen for this particular piece of work.
Thank you for your response, Kaushal. Could I now move on to the chat box and start with a comment rather than a question? We do have one of our alumnus who has thanked you for your presentation. And the comment is that the concept of intersectionality is well put in practice. But also, please consider using sports as a tool and a platform for implementing your programs. The alumnus who's mentioned this is Stephen, and Stephen is heavily involved with sport for disability and working with individuals with disability. And he's sharing this feedback, to include sports, use sports as a tool and a platform for implementing your programs.
Absolutely, Evangeline. I agree with you about that because we had consultation with women in sports and sporting body, and we asked them, what does economic empowerment mean to you? And they said, oh, it means we get the same amount of money in our contracts as men. Because there's huge differentiation between the kind of access to sporting facilities and equipment that women have compared to our male rugby players, the remuneration they get, the kind of contracts that they get. There's a huge unfair disadvantage between that. And I think from an economic lens, we did look at that and see how we can work with sports association and Ministry of Sports to work on these kind of disparities and discrimination that they face.
That's quite interesting. Thank you, Kaushal. Moving on, I am a bit conscious about time, so I'm going to quickly move through maybe two or three questions very quickly. Um, so the next question is, are there any initiatives in Fiji on the nexus between gender and climate change, while looking at how existing inequalities like patriarchy and labor dynamics in households increase the vulnerabilities of women in climate-related disasters?
Yes, there are lots of projects because climate change is such a major issue within Fiji and the Pacific region. There's so many things happening in this space by different actors and stakeholders, and one of the challenges is trying to connect and engage and map what is happening and who's doing what, particularly in relation to women. There's a large flagship of program called Women's Resilience to Disasters that is being done by UN Women, and it looks at women from a livelihood income perspective in terms of adaptive income opportunities or diversifying income streams so that women are more resilient when it comes to natural disasters, especially within the agriculture economy. Is a significant amount of work happening in the policy space to ensure that our natural disaster policies, plans, and actions are gender inclusive. And that ties down to right to the communities and villages. So all the villages have to have their disaster preparedness response plan. They have a committee and women are involved in that. Who's responding how? There's special provisions also in terms of what happens in preparedness, especially for households that are single female headed households or that have persons living with vulnerabilities. How do you make the evacuation centers safe uh, 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 while people are living there after disaster? So a number of things along those lines are happening, but a lot of work by the Women's Resilience to Disaster program.
That's quite interesting to know. And I am aware we do have a few alumni from the Fiji and the Pacific region in the audience. And I really hope, especially working in the climate action field. So I do hope, these conversations are continued in the post-webinar networking session. Um, all right. Next question is by Nicola. Nicola is asking, how do we ensure equality in terms of accessing resources for girls and women during natural disasters?
That's a very interesting question. And I think some of the things we found out from our consultation is one, parametric insurance, so that through mobile the money platforms and technologies is something that's very easy to access. It's very convenient and it can be easily dispersed within post-disaster context. So that has been useful, and a lot of women, say women market vendors, are signing up for this parametric insurance so that in case if there's a disaster, there's loss and damage, they can access insurance to it. The other thing we've noticed was that there's disparity in terms of access to information about relief efforts and packages and grants that is given you during post-disaster context. So creating a much more access to information for women. So a lot of, because it's a communal setting, we have a lot of women's groups and networks that are active within the locations. So trying to tap into those networks to pass information around is something that we're exploring in terms of its usefulness. And one of the things we've identified is that there are certain sectors and industries that are not considered when it comes to existing grants. So, example, women in floriculture, it's not considered, floriculture is not considered an industry for some reason. So we have to get that industry recognized so that women are then able to access relief efforts and packages and grants for that particular sector. So it's going and understanding the intersectionality on what gets recognized and what not, and trying to see that there's no discrimination and there's equal access and opportunity for everyone.
Definitely, there is still a lot of work to be done. Thank you for that. And there's one more question, but I'm wondering if Alexandra wants to unmute and ask their question. And this will be the final question before we move on to the next segment.
Yeah, hello. And thank you for giving us a good overview of what is happening with gender issues at Fiji. So what I wanted to know is about policies implementation, and I'm asking this using the context of Ghana. That's where I come from, and I know women activists are always pushing for adopting policies, but then at the end of the day, when it comes to implementation, nothing is done. And so there are action plans, there are policies, but we are not able to achieve our goals. So I want to know, how is it like in Fiji when it comes to policies implementation and implementation of action plans? Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra. That is a very, very good question. I think the struggle is same everywhere. You can have a very beautiful piece of document that has taken like a year to consult and write up, and you have an amazing M&E framework set up for it. Uh, um, and then it just sits on the shelf and nothing happens, and then past 5 years then everyone says, oh, this policy actually has needs to be reviewed and it needs to be redone again, and that cycle continues in a way that's not productive or transformative. So one of the things we are trying to do differently for the national action plan is we want to get existing commitments, or what is the stakeholders are really interested in and will commit to doing as part of the national action plan than just putting in random actions that we think should be done. So it's costed, and it's going to be, this is an action, this is the timeline, this is the person that's doing it, and this is the reporting mechanisms that you're doing it, and then have a we task force or a annual WeNet summit where there is accountability in processes. So we try to do it differently. And one of the lessons we learned was when we did the gender-based violence national action plan, it was very comprehensive. It had around 100 plus actions. And right now there's a real struggle in terms of implementing those actions because the stakeholders were not very clear. There wasn't a buy-in, like the buy-in is also a negotiated process. So, but we want to have the buy-in right from the moment we start writing those actions into our policy. And we want to have donor commitment and resources linked to those actions. And we want to have spaces like the summit or the task force or governance mechanism that continues to build, reinforce that sense of ownership and commitment that was already made. So those are some of the ways we're thinking of how to do it better in a way that it just doesn't just sit on a shelf, but it's actually a commitment that moves things forward, and there is a clear pathway towards implementing it. We also develop a socialization plan for this particular action plan to see how it can be socialized. And having a government gender action mainstreaming group as an infrastructure and architecture also helps to escalate work from plan to actual actions. But generally, I agree with you. That's always been a challenge, not just in Fiji, but my Pacific Islander colleagues who are here would also recognize that happening within the Pacific region, within their own countries as well. You have lots of policies and action plans that's being developed, but then everyone forgets about them.
Oh, okay. I don't know if maybe I can add this due to time.
Yes.
Okay, so how is the political context? I know sometimes when we talk about these policies not being implemented, what I've realized is when we talk about the political context, we look at things, but we also don't look at how governments try to also win elections. Because and that's what I'm working on, looking at political clientelism and how pervasive is it in Ghana. So what I've realized is sometimes because government may want to do it, but because they also need to win elections, they realize that, oh, okay, if this policy does not provide any incentives for winning elections, they are not really going to, take it on. So I just want to know, how's the political context when it comes to how government try to win elections and how, they try to, so what role does women also, play in providing these incentives, for government? And, how do they see that in helping them win elections?
That's absolutely true. The agenda of the government of the day, because and what are the strategies that I've noticed that government uses is that when they're trying to win another term, then they'll try and ride on the agendas of things that they have already done, particularly in gender spaces, to win more women voters to their side. So they'll talk about the gender commitments that they've covered or captured or progressed on. So there's a lot more visibility around gender work when you in the cups of a next election. The other thing I've noticed is priorities can completely change depending on the government of the day. When we did the Fiji country gender assessment, we were told to remove the ethnicity data because it was too sensitive of an issue. And then once we removed it, then the elections happened and the new government came in and the new government said, where's the ethnicity data? Why is it not there? It's important and needs to be added. So we had to go back and re-put all of those data back again into the country gender assessment. So that's one example of how priorities can affect or influence the work that we do in both positive and negative ways. But majority of the trend you notice is things get passed through cabinet approval very, very quickly if there's a next election happening, just to make sure that there's commitment and that particular piece of work will not be stuck or will be people need to progress and improve. So I agree with you, taking into account the election cycles and government is important. And it does affect you.
Okay, so Alexander, were you going to say something?
I was saying thank you. Yeah, thank you for explaining that. That is clear. Thank you.
Thank you so much for all your questions, for sending them via the registration forms as well as in the chat box. These were highly appreciated. Your presentation was highly appreciated, Kaushal. I would now like to end the Q&A session because we will then run out of time for the next segment. But if you would like to get in touch with Kaushal, please feel free to send her an email or get in touch via LinkedIn. Kaushal is more than happy to take the conversation forward or respond to any queries that you might have regarding her work, regarding the webinar topic, or in general, if you would just like to know more about, gender disparities in the Fiji and the Pacific region. This has been quite an insightful webinar presentation and discussion. So thank you so much, Kaushal, for your presentation and for highlighting your work as well as the ongoing work in Fiji for gender and development. So thank you so much for your presentation, and thank you so much everyone who have attended the webinar and sent in your questions. I would now like to invite you all for the post-webinar networking session. Kaushal, you're more than welcome to stay online for the session and be a part of the discussion. But as you can see on the screen, we will get into smaller groups, smaller breakout room groups to network with each other. If you have any further discussions on the webinar topic, if you would like to hear more from other attendees who are working within the space or ask any queries to other attendees, network, share your research around the topic, please feel free to network with each other and connect with each other within the smaller discussion groups. Equally, you could also discuss, I have put in a few questions on, 2 questions on, just to start off conversations. So please feel free to discuss on, what are your experiences of working within the gender and development space in your country. Equally, you could also discuss gender and climate action, or what are the challenges faced in general. Please do stir conversations amongst your group. We will in regards to time, we will have only around 15 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes for the conversation. So we will now move into the breakout room groups, and then we will come back just for a final goodbye and thank you. So looking forward to the discussions in the breakout room groups.